Hi, I'm Jason Carr. I'm a technology development rep with Bayer Crop Science. I appreciate this opportunity to share with you some of the research, some of the things we've learned over the past few years about soybeans and how we can increase profitability. So there's two things I'd like to really talk about. One is soybean planting date and how that affects yield, and also fungicide use and what we can expect from that. So thank you for your time, and I hope this can be a benefit to you.
So here we're going to talk about our planting date study for 2021. This is a trial we've done for a few years now. It's a multiple location trial where we look at both corn and soybean planting dates and what effect those planting dates have on yield.
Yeah, I think, Preston, I'm kind of excited about this data. We've been doing it for about 4 years now.
Yep.
And the viewers probably have heard of how soybeans are being planted earlier than ever before over the last, especially couple years. And I feel like we're kind of a big part of that by generating some data that gives farmers confidence.
Absolutely.
And being able to plant earlier.
Yeah.
Whenever I talk to a grower that started planting earlier, they're always pretty happy, really.
Yep.
It allows them a bigger time frame to get their job done. And there's less risk than we initially had thought. We've kind of proven.
So start planting soybeans in February. Got it. Actually, I think you did though, right?
So this picture here was in November.
Okay.
In 2019.
November of 2019.
Yeah.
Did anything come up?
No.
Not a bean. Okay.
Don't do that.
Wait till,
Yeah.
So plant early is the takeaway,
Yeah.
but not too early.
Yeah.
So we'll get right into some data here.
So there's a couple, I have this data in a couple different ways, Preston. There's some different things we can look at. So here, this is just 2021 data here. And this is looking at what our stand was and what our yield was across planting dates in 2021.
How many locations for this?
This is actually a single location
Okay.
here, and this is just kind of an example
Yep.
of what we're going to be looking at. So you can see here, this blue line is the stand, and you can see when we plant really early, beginning of March, we really hurt our stand.
Mm-hmm.
As we get into kind of mid-April, our stand really is fairly flat. You can see that curve is fairly flat. And there's some, this being a single location, you're going to have some variation in there. But basically, once we get to mid-April, we can count on getting about 100% of the stand we were expecting.
So you planted 140 then?
Right.
Okay.
These are all planted at 140, exactly. But what you can see here is this yield line is also kind of flat up until the middle of April, even at reduced stands early. So, the soybeans really have an amazing ability to compensate and overcome. And then as we get later in the year, even though our population stays high, our yield drops off. And so it's pretty typical to see that.
You said this is for a 3.5 bean?
This is a 3.5 bean, exactly.
Okay.
Yep. So we collect a lot of different data. And this is just another look at that population information, how, this is a 2 years of work here where we counted populations.
Yep.
And we can see, when we plant early, we're definitely going to affect stand a little bit. But the soybeans, as we pointed out, have the ability to make up for it. And as we look at a little bit more data, I think that'll be pretty clear. Really the reason why, when we get into this yield and we see the yield advantage, the main reason is that when we plant early, the soybeans have more time to create nodes. Mm-hmm. They create a node about every 3.5 days if they're growing well. And so if we get something in the ground, the last couple of years we planted March 10th and March 7th, which probably don't recommend that growers go that early, but we do that in order to see what happens and see what happens if we push things. So you can see, how many days, we're not actually looking at nodes here, we're looking at how many days the soybean had to grow. Mm-hmm. And so when it has to grow quite a few days to grow, it can create more nodes, and we'll look at that in a minute. But you can see here that those ones we planted in March didn't flower for over 3 months. Now, part of that was they stayed in the ground, in some cases for 40 days or even more.
Right.
But after planting, it was a long time till flowering. Those soybeans can really put on nodes, put on branches even, and just really set the foundation for high yield. So when we look at that node number, we can see here that, when we plant early, you can see one thing about this graph is when we look at mid-April on, it's almost a linear drop in the number of nodes. When we go earlier than mid-April, it's the curve kind of flattens out a little bit. It's not so linear, and part of that is because in these cases, when we plant at the beginning of March, as I mentioned before, it might take a month and a half to come out of the ground. Obviously, they're not creating nodes underground, so. But this is, the important thing here, that when we talk about soybeans, we talk about planting early. The reason we do that is a couple reasons. One is to manage workload. I mean, if growers have 5,000 acres to plant, it's really to their advantage sometimes to get some of that out of the way earlier than they would have done in the past, but also to get increased yield potential. Now, one thing, when I kind of started doing this work, when we started doing this 4 years ago, maybe we'd heard about early planting and we thought, well, we're going to plant at the beginning of April and we're going to get 100 bushel, or, we're going to really set yield records. Well, it doesn't exactly turn out that way. What we really see in our data that we've generated, and this is across 4 locations over 3 years, and so pretty extensive. You grew it here at Monticello. We've also grown it up in northern Illinois, in Woodford County, also a lot of different places across the state. And we've planted as many planting dates as we can get in the ground. So that could be 3 in some cases, that could be up to 8 in some cases. It just depends on what we have the ability to do. But really what we've seen is we have our best chance for maximum yield early. So I should just explain this graph real briefly. It's on a 0 to 100% scale, and that allows us to look at yield across years. So, and location. So, we might have an 80 bushel yield potential in one location, and we might have a 60 in a different location, a different year. And given that we have all different planting dates, that can really make the graph look funny. So what we say is we take the highest yielding planting date for that year in that location, we call that 100%, and we graph all those against that. And I think it's pretty clear in this graph that we start early, all these numbers are 90% or above up until the end of April. But then as we get later than that, we see more of these lower numbers that go down, 60 or 70%, even 65% in some cases. So, if we have a 95% chance of having our highest yield at the beginning of April, and we have a 65% yield level, at the beginning of June, that just shows what the advantage is with setting up that potential for yield.
Absolutely. And this was a range of maturities, or was this mostly 3.5?
Yeah, this is a range of maturities.
Okay. Do you see a difference in response?
So we haven't. We've tried to look at that and really haven't generated any difference. Now, one thing when we start looking at the different maturities, obviously every variety is different, so they have different yield potentials. And so really to look at that maturity response alone, you'd have to have a pretty big set of varieties that you'd be planting. And so really that's kind of outside of the scope of what we're trying to determine here.
Right.
So this spring and last year, those March plantings were very early, and they got frost both years. Some people might have seen some pictures of the beans that we had that had frost on them. We got down to 26, I think, overnight when this March planting this year was out of the ground. We monitored those for several days, and then that was, by the beginning of May, we could have come back in and replanted if we were concerned about that stand, and still had a pretty good yield potential. But we didn't replant. We planted another planting date beside it so that we can kind of make that comparison. So we have the ones that we would have replanted and then the replant, and we can kind of compare how they would have performed.
Absolutely.
So across the past 2 years, what we saw is the blue bars here are the yield, and the March planting, again, that's very early, for most growers, we saw about 69 bushel. This is 2 locations, or this is 1 location in 2 years. And then the replants, even with the higher stand that you can see in the yellow bars of about 50,000 more plants per acre, they yielded about 3.5 bushel less.
Impressive.
And so it's, if farmers are out there looking at they got frost damage on their field, should I replant? I would say in a lot of cases, probably not.
Yeah. Is there a population threshold that would trigger that decision for you?
Well, I've always said about 80,000. But I'm starting to wonder if it's not even a little bit lower, maybe. Now, I'm not a big fan of planting ultra low populations. I think we're going to look at some data later on, but I think that 140,000 is a nice number to plant, maybe 120 in some cases for a population. But I'm not a big fan of, there's some talk about going lower than that. I think it increases your risk, and it doesn't gain you much as far as seed cost or whatever that might be.
Agreed. So these last two slides, Jason, have showed tremendous yield potential to an early planted soybean at a low population. Have you looked at population curves at all as far as yield response goes?
Yeah, that's a good question, and it's something I've been wondering about myself. And we actually started to look at that this year, and we have a little bit of data. We're going to extend this out a little bit more next year. But what we did is we planted across these 8 planting dates. Planted this 3.5 bean at 100, 120,000, 140,000. And a lot of times the agronomic recommendation is if you plant really early, you might want to go a little higher to kind of give yourself a few more plants because you're going to lose some of them. If you plant late, you might want to go a little bit higher population so that you can have plenty of plants out there, and they're not going to grow as much, so you want to capture as much sunlight as you can. But really, in this, again, I'm going to caution people, this is a single location, this is a single year, but if you look at these graphs here, really, there's no correlation between the planting date and the population and the yield. So the planting date is highly correlated to yield, but the population doesn't seem to be a huge factor. As you can see here, even planting 100,000 compared to 140,000 planting early, we're within a couple bushels there. And then, in the second planting date, our 120,000 was highest, and then the next planting date, our higher population was higher. So there's not a lot of correlation that we've seen yet. We're going to generate some more data that in the upcoming years.
So if you're a farmer watching this, your key take-home message is plant your soybeans as early as possible. Population is the secondary conversation.
Exactly. Yeah. I think so. And again, as we mentioned before, I think 140,000 is probably a nice number to go with.
Which is the U of I recommendation.
Yeah.
Yep. Perfect.
So we haven't talked about one of the biggest benefits to planting soybeans early yet, and that is to let the farmers with an itchy trigger finger get out there and plant something, instead of pushing the envelope on corn.
Right, because you planted corn in these trials too at the same planting dates, correct?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So we wanted to generate some information about what's the penalty, what's the benefit to planting soybeans early? We've kind of established it's not very much penalty to planting early, and there is a benefit, at least a potential benefit.
Yep.
But with corn, we all know corn's a little bit less forgiving than soybeans, but it's always nice to generate some data to kind of show that. So for the last couple of years, we've been planting corn and soybeans on all the same planting dates, so that we can see how they perform relative to each other. So again, this year, this is what we saw this year. We planted the corn at that very early date, and we actually, this graph is, we didn't actually plant the corn at the March 10th planting date. That's just part of the curve going over there. We didn't plant corn that early. We planted corn starting on the second planting date on April 7th. So this is actually where the corn planting started. And you can see here, as we plant early, our corn yield is going to go up if we wait for a little bit better conditions. There's a penalty to planting corn earlier, and we know that. Planting corn into suboptimal conditions is never a good thing. Right. But beans, as long as the soil conditions are okay, I'm personally not that concerned about what the forecast looks like. Even if it's going to be cold, even if we think there's going to be a frost, beans are a lot more forgiving of frost than people realize.
Surprising.
Yeah, it's totally not what conventional wisdom was.
Right, conventional even 5 years ago. Is you burn the cotyledons off and you're done, right? But with corn, you're able to regrow below the ground level.
Yeah. But we've really seen kind of a different story in our research.
Yeah.
So, I'm a big believer in numbers, so if I see it with my own eyes and there's the numbers to back it up, I'll change my mind.
Yep.
So like I said, we've been doing this for 2 years, and so this graph, it shows the 2 years data compiled, and it's kind of the same thing that we talked about before. We graphed on a 0 to 100% so that we can compare across years. But this is all the corn and soybean planting dates where we planted a comparison. And you can see here really the same thing that we saw in 2021, but as we go over a number of years, we really start to generate a nice smooth curve. And what we see is, up until about mid-April, which is the traditional planting date for corn, right? April 15th is kind of the traditional, at least in a lot of our areas, where people would start planting corn. That's where we see, the corn kind of pass up the soybeans, but really the optimal date, what we've seen in this, just 2 locations, but I think it's indicative, is early May for maximum corn yield. And then for soybeans, we see kind of what we've seen before. We see that kind of flat, and then it drops off as we get later in the growing season.
It's actually surprising to me how high the corn curve stays, even into early mid-June is where it basically crosses that 90% level, which I assumed it would be 80% by that point. So that's
exactly. Yeah. There's just, I guess the corn window, there's maybe a narrower window for corn, and it's maybe a little bit later than what we think.
Interesting.
And soybeans, really any time early, we're looking at fairly low risk, I believe. Oh.
Cool. Well, that's a great data set, Jason. It's exciting research. We look forward to continuing this research on, for next year, 2022. We're actually going to probably add at least one location to this data set. So the cool thing about this curve is it's a curve we can just refine over time and add more data points. More data points, more power. So look forward to bringing that to you next year as well. So the next study we want to share with you guys today is our small plot soybean by fungicide and population study. This is a small plot trial that we placed across Illinois. How many locations do we have total?
It's quite a few. We've placed it at about 6 or 7 locations over the last 3 years. The locations aren't always the same. One year we have one.
Pretty widely distributed though.
Right, from down by Decatur all the way up to towards Chicago.
Cool. This is a small plot trial, like I said, so definitely a shout out to our ARMs, our ag research managers, who conduct these trials out in the field with their small plot equipment.
Yeah, that allows us, doing those small plot trials have some benefits. So a lot of the trials we conduct are strip trials, and those have a certain, those allow us to see how things perform more in a farmer-like setting. But this allows us to replicate and randomize and do some things that give real good data.
Absolutely. So 4 replications per site, right?
Right.
Okay.
Yep.
Great. So let's jump right into the data from 2021 and the previous few years.
So, President, I think that the most important thing when we start talking about trials is, it's great to see what yields the best. It's great to see what controls disease, but the bottom line is, does it pay for a farmer? Mm-hmm. And so I always like to look at ROI, and I know you do too.
Absolutely, yeah.
And so here we're looking at different populations with and without fungicide. And so populations ranging from 60,000 to 160,000 over the past 3 years here we're looking at. And so one thing that really stands out here that we can see immediately is, I'm no mathematician, but this line's higher than this line, I think.
The blue line's definitely higher than the orange line, yep.
So that's the fungicide line, and really consistently across populations. And really it's interesting, the curves kind of follow each other here, even though we have, kind of an unexplained little dip here at 140,000, but we really see consistently about a $40 benefit to the fungicide application. That's even figuring in the cost of the application being around $30.
So regardless of population planted, fungicide always paid for the last couple of years.
Exactly. That's what this data bears out.
Interesting.
Yep. And so one thing we see here also is that if we're looking at a fungicide application, you can see here on this blue bar, our maximum ROI is at 120,000 population. So, we still see population or yield increases as we go with a higher population, but not enough to give us additional benefit when we factor in the cost of the seed.
Right.
Now, when we look at a lower input type system where we don't apply a fungicide and look at different populations, we have to get to 160,000 here to get our maximum ROI if we're not. But we're still leaving $40 on the table by not putting the fungicide on.
Interesting. Most of these trials had a normal planting date for the area.
They were a little bit on the late side, unfortunately. Okay. So we talked about the small plot research, and that's one of the limitations of the small plot research is getting things in the ground in a timely manner. They have to be packaged into a certain way so that they can use our cassette planters to plant them. And they have a lot of other things that are very important. You talked earlier about national protocols, and those kind of take precedence over some of this regional work that we do.
Yep. So Jason, at these locations, did you have a chance to actually get out in the field and look at the level of disease pressure that you had in these trials?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked. I have a graph.
All right. I may have helped rate at least one of these locations.
Yeah. Appreciate that. So yeah, that's one thing. Last couple of years, we started looking at just the population, we're looking at the yield, but really what we want to understand is how does that affect disease, a different population? Kind of the common understanding or agronomic advice might be that at a lower population you should have a little bit less disease development. And so when we looked at disease development across these populations, here we have the blue is no fungicide and the orange is fungicide, and we rate these on a 1 to 9 scale. So 1 would mean I couldn't find a single drop of disease out there, and a 9 would be, it's a disaster. The thing is so lit up with disease that, it's going to lose a bunch of yield. And so that's a 1 to 9 scale, as you know, and you can see here, we're looking at fairly low levels of disease development. And part of that's because, as you mentioned, planting later. And so we see a pretty significant increase, though, in disease ratings, better disease rating, when we apply the fungicide, which we'd expect. Sort of, fungicide has plant health benefits, but it also controls disease.
That's what I was going to ask. So on your previous ROI slide, there was such a dichotomy between the sprayed versus the unsprayed. Is there other synergistic effects that the fungicide's providing, or do you have any speculation as to any value the fungicide brings beyond disease control?
Yeah, I think we have some data here showing that we see benefits to fungicide even in fairly low disease pressure fields, and we know that certain components of fungicides can inhibit ethylene production, which is it's a hormone that a plant produces in response to stress.
Right.
Everybody knows what happens to a banana if you put it in a paper bag. It gets brown faster. Yeah. That's because of ethylene. And so all plants give that off in stress situations, and fungicides can reduce that, and they can stay healthy longer. Another interaction we might want to look at is row spacing in population. So the question is, should I plant at a narrower row spacing? In a lot of situations that does make sense, and we can see here it's worth a couple bushels in yield if you have the ability to plant in 20-inch rows over 30s. And that's pretty consistent. We've seen that, this is data from 2021, but we've seen that pretty consistently over the last few years. So you see, a little bit of a ROI benefit from planting in narrower rows. Now, when we talk about narrow rows, one thing we could be concerned about is if you're going to go into narrower rows, would you see more lodging, or would you see more lodging in 30-inch rows where the plants are closer together? So we know as we crowd plants, they grow a little bit taller, they're a little bit more likely to fall over.
Yep.
But what we saw here is, yes, at a higher population, yes, we see more lodging. Again, fairly low. This is also a 1 to 9 scale, where 1 was very little lodging and 9 would be flat on the ground. And so you can see this is more leaning than lodging, I would say. But we do see increase with higher population, but we did not see a correlation between the row width and the lodging. So that's kind of interesting. I don't know if I knew what to expect, but that's what we've kind of seen over the last couple of years.
It's interesting. So more plants per row space may have the same effect if you are seeing that trend line.
Possibly.
Yeah.
So again, do the narrower rows make a difference in disease development? We know that a lower population can help with disease development. We saw some data there. But does it make a difference if that's in 20-inch rows or 30-inch rows? And we, again, as we go higher in population, we see more disease development, but the 20-inch rows had slightly more disease development than the 30-inch rows. But if we put that on a 1 to 9 scale rather than a 1 to 2.6, that difference is
minimal.
Going to be hard to see. Yep. And again, it all comes back to profitability. So this is a compilation of 3 years of data across 3 different locations. Again, those replications we were talking about. When we look at the planting rate, we look at the row width. We see a higher yield, income potential in the narrower rows, which we talked about that earlier, but we don't really see a correlation between the row width and the population. So it's not like in a 20-inch row, 160,000 makes sense, and in a 30-inch row, 120,000 is the best, or vice versa. Really, if you can get into 20s, it's kind of a separate conversation. What do you think is your best population? What row width do you think is your best? But you don't necessarily have to be concerned about kind of fine-tuning it based on what system you're going with. The one final thing I want to look at here, Preston, is just, these graphs that I've been showing have been at a $12 soybean price for estimate, which is higher than last few years prior to this year. And so, in those calculations in prior years, we used about an $8, estimate.
Yeah.
And what we saw in the $8 estimate was really our most profitable planting population is about 120,000. Even though we get higher yield at a higher population, it didn't pay for the additional seed. But if we're talking $12 beans, we see it, even at 160,000. Right. Yeah. So, a grower making this decision, I still am pretty comfortable with 140, 130,000. But if a grower is thinking we're going to have high commodity prices, want to push yield a little bit, I think they might see some benefit.
This is interesting because there's a lot of chatter about 60, 80,000 population per acre beans, and this data suggests that may not be a good idea. You may be okay with it, but the risk is probably not worth the potential reward from a seed cost savings perspective.
Absolutely, and when we're talking about planting early, which there's a big benefit to planting early, a big potential benefit. We don't want to go with 80,000 beans where we might end up with 40,000 and get in a replant situation.
Cool.
If we had 80,000 after emergence, no problem. But planting that, I'd be a little concerned.
So I guess as a final wrap up for the farmers, takeaway, you're okay sticking with 140,000 population, 20s versus 30s, probably not consequential which row spacing you choose, and then finally push beans as early in the season, planting season as possible. What about treating those early planted soybeans? Anything you do different with those beans versus a bean you plant in May? From a seed treatment perspective?
Nothing I'd necessarily do different because I'd throw the whole load on, whether you're planting in April or May. But definitely, if you're looking at trying to save some money on seed treatment, maybe even go with untreated beans, I wouldn't plant those before the beginning of May, probably.
Okay.
So you're probably going to have to stay off of the early planting bandwagon if you're not willing to put on a treatment.
Okay. Right on. So this is a study we intend to continue into next year, 2022. With more data, we can kind of fine tune some of these recommendations for central Illinois, northern Illinois, some of these Illinois regions. So stay tuned and we'll continue to update this data as it comes out.
Yeah.